So welcome everyone to our sort of EdTech webinar for this week, and hopefully everyone is well and had a good day at school. And our focus for sort of this afternoon for this particular WebPed is on embedding, retrieval and space practice. So as we go through the webinar, if you do have any questions, please just drop them into the chat, and I'll use that as an opportunity at the end. We have got a bit of a Q&A session, and I'll go through those questions at the end and try and answer those questions during that Q&A session. In terms of our newsletter, so we have our newsletter, which is here, which you can use to sign up and keep up to date with our sort of EdTech approach and how our journey has been shaped since the sort of original lockdown, and the sort of strategies and the practices that we put in place as a trust and as sort of EdTech demonstrator school. And also we share some of the sort of experiences that we've had, and I suppose some of the issues that we've come across, because inevitably there's always going to be some teething issues, and those and how we've addressed those to try and improve our sort of remote and hybrid learning provision. And as I said, as we go through, we'll have our Q&A session, so please feel free to keep some of those questions as well if you wish towards the end. Okay, so in terms of a sort of overview of the session, it will probably be roughly around about an hour, maybe slightly less. We'll see how we go, and that will all depend on the questions that you may have at the end. And we'll go through with some welcoming introductions. We'll go through the main session, the Q&A, and then we'll close for this afternoon. Okay, so in terms of a little bit about the King's Leadership's Academy in Warrington's journey, and also how that journey has sort of filtered out into the wider trust over the sort of last sort of 6 months. When we went into lockdown in March, we moved straight away over to a remote learning provision, and that plan had been put in place leading up to the week before we actually went into lockdown. One of the most positive aspects, I suppose, of that planning and preparation that we were able to do as a school was every pupil was able to receive remote learning provision right from the lockdown in March. And that allowed that every pupil didn't miss any hours of learning during that time, and every student received live lessons through their normal timetable, just in an online perspective. That sort of evolved over sort of coming months during that initial lockdown period. We picked up some of the issues that we found during that process. We focused our CPD on how could we as teachers and as a school and as a trust bring about improvements in the sort of remote learning provision and find the sort of opportunities to sort of enhance that remote learning sort of provision that our pupils were receiving. And we've evolved on that over the sort of coming months, and since we returned in September, and we've looked at new ways and new strategies in which we can sort of improve that even further. So just to give you some examples this afternoon, one of the most recent strategies that we put in place is that every teacher within the school has a headset, and that headset was brought about by the feedback that we received from our sort of parliament, our ministers, our student ministers, who actually said that sometimes, because we were zooming out in lessons now, as well as having pupils in the classroom through that hybrid model, that sometimes those pupils were not always hearing the teacher's explanation, and it wasn't always clear. So we've moved towards every teacher now has a form of sort of headset device, and that's helped to improve the clarity of our sort of explanations and the sound experience that our pupils are receiving whilst isolating at home. So a little bit of an introduction about me and myself in terms of my role here at the King's Leadership Academy and within the Trust. So I'm one of the trust leads for geography, and I support the academy in terms of the geography curriculum and the provision across the trust, but as well as leading geography within the academy in Warrington. In terms of my background, I've been teaching now for 13 years, so this is my 13th academic year. And I suppose for a lot of us this afternoon, I think everyone would agree, probably one of the most challenging academic years to have started. But nonetheless, there's been opportunities to look at how our remote learning provision can help support and boost learning. And therefore, when we come out of this at the other end, it may be that we can use this to further provide that additional provision for pupils in different contexts as we move forward. I do have an additional role as a principal examiner, and I've been very lucky to be able to author a couple of books, which is Craft, looking at assessment, and more recently, which will come out in January, a focus on feedback within schools. So you can contact me at m_Chiles if you want to follow me and see some of the tweets that I share and some of the resources that I share. And yeah, we'll get into the session. Unless anyone's got any sort of questions to start off with about our particular provision. Otherwise, we'll get started and make a start today's session. So today's session is focused on retrieval and space practice and looking at how we can, as schools, move towards that sort of utilizing that learning strategies. We know not an assessment strategy, but a learning strategy within a remote context. And I think the image on the screen really sort of depicts the role of retrieval and space practice. It's that idea that as pupils are in lessons, as they're learning, whether that be remotely or whether maybe in the classroom, whether that be through our sort of hybrid blended model, but actually we're providing our pupils with more rich knowledge through the concepts and processes within our subjects. And the more that we enrich that knowledge, the more we give them opportunities to retrieve that knowledge. And the more that we do that, the better that retrieval becomes. So if we was to have a definition of retrieval practice, this is probably something along the lines of what we would say. It is about it being a learning strategy and not an assessment tool. And it's about how can we as teachers create opportunities to activate pupils to think hard and bring information to mind. And I think that more recently, over the last couple of years, retrieval practice has become one of those tools and one of those learning strategies that evidence-based research has suggested is powerful. But as we've moved towards this remote learning model in a lot of schools, and as we've got this blended learning model, it may be that it's not always a sort of strategy that we can utilize as well as what we maybe could. The key bit, though, is that when we're activating pupils to think hard and uncover what knowledge they actually know, this can enhance and boost learning. And it's that action of actively retrieving that knowledge that boosts learning. And that's the really important bit that we need to hold on to when we're using retrieval and we're trying to space it out, is that we want it to be the active retrieval of knowledge, and we want it to be about boosting overall learning. So in terms of this idea of how can we generate our reflective learners, we know a common definition now that is out and about in the sort of education sphere, that idea that learning is a change in long-term memory. And whether we're doing our sort of lesson within the classroom, or whether we're doing it remotely, or whether we're doing it in a blended context, we need to keep in mind that actually, even more so with the remote learning provision that we provide, it is about putting in place those strategies that allow for that active retrieval of knowledge and allow for that embedding of knowledge over time so that they're able to demonstrate learning. And as we know, and as David Diddell talked about if you joined us in one of our previous EdTech sessions and webinars on the cognitive load theory, we know that actually learning is unseen. We don't see it. We often see performance. And if we think about how and where has retrieval practice been born from, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is now quite a well-known experiment about his sort of research where he conducted an experiment on himself, being able to recall information, and he sort of deduced that over time, that information recall deteriorated through the duration of the initial exposure or initial learning. And as we can see there, the graph demonstrates that retention of knowledge will depreciate over time. And I think that when we're considering the degree of differences in terms of how remote sort of learning has been set up, this probably is more prevalent, that actually there's probably been greater widening of certain knowledge gaps as a result of forgetting information and forgetting learning that they've been initially exposed to. And then we come to that idea of what do we mean by spaced versus massed practice. And this builds on Ebbinghaus' study and research, where he said that a suitable distribution of repetitions over a space of time is decidedly more advantageous than the massing of them at a single time. Following on from that research, there was research done through Roediger and Karpicke, and their famous study built on the initial work from Ebbinghaus, looking at how certain control groups were affected, and difference between a control group whereby they were given the opportunity to actively recall information over a period of time and repetition, and another group that didn't undertake that recall, they just did the test. And that's brought about the positive impact of that active recall. So that's a little bit about the research, a bit of a refresher about the research, and it may be that you're already aware of that research, but I feel it's always important with any sort of strategy that we're looking at, just to recap that research and look at and latch onto what it is that we're looking at this afternoon. So the first aspect of how we can do this within a remote learning context, one of the aspects that we've looked at as a school is starting a lesson with that very quick sort of Doug Lemov strategy of bell-to-bell work, getting pupils in and getting them started in activity. Now, inevitably, that's been more challenging with the sort of blended learning approach. But what we've been able to do is, through our sort of platform of using Zoom to sort of broadcast our lessons, is we've been able to dual share our screens to enable pupils to be able to see what it is that is being presented for that lesson, but also the pupils in the classroom can see it simultaneously. Now, by doing that, what we've also done is had this up ready right at the start of a lesson. So as soon as any pupil comes into the Zoom classroom, they're ready to go straight away with their sort of 6-a-day knowledge recall quiz. What we've done is, as we said, we've had the headset. So we've invested in those headsets to improve that sort of actual crisp in terms of the quality of the explanation that our pupils are receiving when they're isolating at home. But it means that as teachers are greeting those that are still in school at the door and doing that introduction and welcome them into the classroom to make a start, we can already be having that conversation with those pupils that are coming in remotely through the Zoom platform. One of the things that we did notice, and this is something that maybe as a school, that if you are using a Zoom platform for remote learning provision, or you're using Microsoft Teams, is actually at the start of a lesson, it can be quite busy, and there can be a lot to do. So we've, reflecting on our practice, we've actually looked to enable on Zoom the notification when someone comes into the link, and therefore we can get them in straight away without delay. What that's enabled us to do, especially with our retrieval practice, is enabled us to have a very sort of streamlined start to our lessons, and a very sort of quick start, whereby pupils, whether they are within the classroom or whether they are learning at home, they're able to get started on something straight away. You'll notice here that no matter whether it is in classroom or whether it is at home, the important part about this quiz is about recalling knowledge over time. And these questions sometimes look differently across subjects, but the essential process here is pupils are recalling knowledge from memory, and they are also having the opportunity to recall that knowledge over a different sort of time period. Now, some of the things that we have considered is that obviously when pupils are at home and isolating, inevitably they could potentially look at answers because we can't necessarily see what they're doing. And I think Doug Lemov talked about in his most recent book on online lessons that pupils will inevitably want to sort of blank their screen because they don't want to be seen at home, or for like a security, for their own security point of view, they want to blank the screen and not be seen. And that's fine, and therefore we cannot always see whether they're actually doing this from memory. So part of our drive as a school and part of our drive is to sort of align our sort of remote learning and blended learning approach is to actually explain this process to pupils, to say to them, this is why we do retrieval practice. This is the important bit of it. And the only person that you are disadvantaging by trying to do it from your resources at home is yourself. And it's really important that we continually share with pupils the power of actually retrieving from memory. What we've then done is we've created some online workbooks through Google Classroom. So our online workbooks allow us to capture what's happening in the lesson simultaneously whilst pupils are working in the classroom. And then we can quickly go in to that online workbook and we can see that the pupils have already got their sort of 6 questions that they've had a go at. That online workbook, we created a template for our pupils, and each subject's sort of molded that template to their own preference, how they want to start their retrieval practice at the beginning of a lesson. And that's enabled us to create some continuity across year groups within subjects. And then what we've been able to do then is give feedback on that particular retrieval activity through the notes and the comments within Google Classroom. We've also looked at the potential, and certain subjects are investigating some online quizzing tools, which obviously as a school, each child has a device. So each child has either an iPad or some form of iPad to be able to use both in lessons when they're in the classroom or when they're isolating at home. So what we have done there is we've explored the use of a number of different online quizzing tools to promote the retrieval of knowledge. So we've looked at Plickers, and you may have heard of Plickers. Some subjects are trialing the use of Plickers to promote that active recall of knowledge. We've also looked at the use of quizzes for active recall. And then we've also utilized the Google Forms as a way to do our recall quizzes. You can see just a very brief outline at the beginning of, or the starting of the creation of one there. And what some subjects have done to sort of improve the sort of capture of information, inevitably with the remote learning provision, that it's not always as easy to capture and diagnose what pupils have struggled with in that sort of very quick sort of 6 to 7 minute retrieval quiz at the start of the lesson, because they're at home, and unless you directly question them, you don't necessarily know what it is they're able to recall. So to get around that, we've explored and trialed in recent weeks the option of doing the knowledge retrieval quizzes through the Google Forms, so that even when pupils are at home and in the classroom at the same time, they can all be completing it, and then the data can be quickly sort of looked at, and that can help to steer the rest of the lesson. Equally, it could be that that you decide that you want to do the knowledge quiz or some form of knowledge quiz at the end of the lesson based on the learn that's taken place. And that can also allow you to capture that knowledge through the Google Forms, and it can allow you to quickly sort of diagnose any misconceptions for the following lesson to pick up. One of the probably the key points, as people may be aware, is that sometimes the Google Forms are quite sensitive, and in particular when you are creating certain questions, it can sort of lead to responses that are not necessarily accepted. So we've reviewed that and worked hard with that to create questions that are mainly a multiple choice of nature, or will require just 1 or 2 word responses to ensure that knowledge recall is recognized by the online system. We've also utilized, and a lot of pupils have started to invest time in using Quizlet as a way to review knowledge and recall knowledge. Quizlet is really good. If you've not heard of Quizlet, it's a really good online tool, and it allows you as teachers to link into any student account, and also allows you to see what students are doing. So for example, we have worked hard on demonstrating to pupils how to do the most effective flashcard and revision flashcard. And then they've gone away, and whether they have been at home through that remote learning provision or whether they've been in school, they have created a series of flashcards, and then the actual system allows them to practice that active recall as they use those cards they've created. Just noticed someone has popped up with a question. So I'll just pause for a minute. So Julius, I think someone said about does the spaced repetition at Quizlet I'll come back to that question at the end. Just it might be worth, Julie, if you just come on to the, I'll give you the microphone and just share what you mean by that question, so I'm not 100% sure. So in terms of the Quizlet, it does allow for that active recall of knowledge through those flashcards, but also it will mix up those flashcards, and it will allow them to, it will pick up some of their right or wrong answers and focus on the sort of maybe knowledge recall they're not so strong at. And you're able to encourage both that use at home and within school. So it's quite a powerful tool for that sort of retrieval practice. We've then invested and heavily used Seneca as another form of our sort of encouragement through online knowledge recall. And if you're familiar with Seneca, we have as a school and as a trust invested in their sort of premium package. Now they do have a very comprehensive free package, and it does work very well for supporting knowledge recall, whether they are learning at home or in school. But more importantly, the premium package has allowed us to open up and give pupils the sort of wrong answer mode and the smart learning mode. What's really powerful about that is when it comes to knowledge recall, what you often find is that pupils will inevitably revise things that they feel comfortable with, the things that they already know. And that's because as in any sort of any human nature, we want to be revising things that we know, and therefore we want to feel that like we're doing well at revision and get that sort of self-esteem and boost. And often pupils don't put enough effort into where their gaps are. So we've invested in Seneca Premium because that's allowed us to, whether pupils are at home or whether they are in school through this blended learning approach, it's allowed us to set regular retrieval and spaced sort of tasks and opportunities for pupils to focus on where their wrong answers are. And it's allowed us to do it within lessons as well, because there are times, as you said, when we want to capture, we want to diagnose what pupils know through some form of activity. And as I said already in the session, it can be quite difficult to do that through just questioning remotely, especially those pupils that are home and zooming in or coming in from a different online platform. So by creating a small sort of assignment, maybe during a lesson or at the end of a lesson, we've then been able to get all the pupils, whether they're at home or in school, to do that, and that captures the information for us. And then we can use that to inform sort of planning in the next steps of the lesson or the follow-up lesson. So we've really sort of used that to sort of support that process, both through that sort of blended learning approach. So there are some examples really of some online tools that you could use as a school to support teachers and yourselves in capturing information that inevitably we're probably struggling to do when pupils are at home. We're not always able to diagnose where every pupil is at. The other strategy that we've done and we've trialed over the last couple of weeks and months is to look at, as I said, about the online workbook and creating a sort of common template so that no matter whether pupils are at home and no matter whether they are in school, their work is of the same level as it can be, and they're getting the same sort of diet in terms of curriculum. Now, part of that has been to look at the Cornell note system as an opportunity both to interweave a sort of structured note taking when pupils are at home and in school, and also to build in further sort of retrieval practice and space practice opportunities. Now, if you're not familiar with the Cornell note system, it has 3 different sections to it, and often I suppose in the past and more recently, it's become more at the forefront for using in secondary schools in particular. But it's inevitably been something that's probably historically been used in universities. And it's definitely a useful tool to promote greater retrieval practice. It has the 3 sections. It has the main note section where whilst pupils are at home, zooming in our case, or they're in lessons, they make notes and do their sort of key captures of the lesson, the explanation from the teacher in the right-hand side, the main section of the Cornell notes structure. Then there's an opportunity for them to do and ask some questions or thought-provoking questions on the left-hand side, or it might be that in the case of, for us as our school, we talk about pupils knowing this, those very important facts within the lesson. So there's an opportunity for them to capture those on that left-hand side of the Cornell note structure. Then at the bottom is the summary page, and inevitably there's been times where when pupils were all in the classroom that you would do the summary section maybe at the end of the lesson. But this is a great opportunity with sort of the remote learning, is that pupils can do this summary section maybe a few days later, and they then allows them to actively recall. So we're getting them, as we said at the start, retrieval practice is getting them to think hard. That action of thinking hard is where we're then going to help to support and boost learning. So we're getting them to do that when they're at home or in school by reflecting on the lesson, writing the summary a few days later, giving that time for that space between that initial exposure of the sort of knowledge to the point where they review it. Inevitably, with any sort of retrieval practice, the time in which you delay is always dependent upon the sort of complexity of the concept or process that's being studied. And sometimes you may want to delay that sort of reflection period by a week, and sometimes you may want to only delay it by a couple of days. And then that also coincides with the way in which lessons are structured and the number of lessons per week. But most importantly is it's enabled us to promote the use of retrieval practice and space practice regardless of whether they're in school or outside of school, because we've created that structured online template through that Cornell note system to promote that use regardless of whether they're at home or in school. We've then talked, I mean, I've already mentioned about the important bit of the flashcards, and that's sort of born out of those ideas of using those online systems. What we've then done in terms of supporting the use of retrieval practice and space practice within lessons is every teacher has their own sort of personalized online classroom Zoom link, and those Zoom links are shared with everyone within school, so all teachers can dip in and out of those Zoom lessons to go and actively watch and observe other teachers. And that's been helpful in terms of supporting that active use of retrieval practice. Sort of other bit that we tried to do is promote that triangulation with home, and in particular sort of giving parents a guide in terms of how we're approaching our online provision through the sort of the Zoom platform, and how they can support their child in actively recalling knowledge. And also we felt it's really important to give them some form of parental guide of what a typical online remote learning lesson will look like, going through those different stages of how it's set up, why we've gone down that route, the rationale behind it, and then why retrieving knowledge is really important, and how they can support their child when they're learning from home. And then finally, in terms of other strategies, there are a few sort of further readings that you could go into to look at retrieval practice in general. So in the section of the book that I wrote in March, it's got aspects about generating more reflective learners, and how we can use strategies to embed that in a remote learning context. Kate Jones' retrieval practice is really fantastic in terms of the research and resource around that in every classroom. And then a couple of other ones in terms of the sort of powerful teaching and understanding how we learn the visual guide. So finished a little bit earlier, but has anyone got any particular questions and answers? So I just wondered if I could pass the microphone to Julia. So Julia, are you able to unmute? I just wonder if I can.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I'll try now. Are you able to unmute, Julia?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello?
I hear you now. Sorry, the setting. I don't think the setting was right.
You can hear now.
I can now. Yeah. Hi, Julia. Okay.
Yes, I'm fine, thank you. That was very good. I'll be really interested. I'm googling now your school to see what you've got on there, really, and see what we can pinch.
Yeah.
It sounds like we're very much at the same stage in terms of how we use it. We use Teams rather than Google Classrooms, but we've got the same sort of push on using Cornell note-taking and flashcards.
Yeah.
You mentioned Quizlet, so I know Quizlet's really good for we'll do games with students, but Anki is another platform, another app, and that does the spaced repetition with the students. So what it does is that it'll mix the cards up and it will give them different questions based on their responses. So I don't know if other people have used that with their classes.
Yeah, I haven't actually heard of that, but yeah, that sounds really good. We have used when they've created some flashcards, we've sometimes used online number pickers and got them to number some of those flashcards. And we've also sort of shared the Letner system with them, so how they can use the Letner system both at home and in school to support that sort of spaced recall.
Yeah, I think the Anki, it's ANKI, that's got the Letner system already built into it. So I think that's what it's doing. Oh,
brilliant. Yeah, so thanks for that. Thanks for that, Julia. That's great. So Julia, I know that Christina said she didn't quite catch the name of the app. It was Anki, so ANKI. Thanks, Julia.
All right, thank you.
Does anyone else have any other sort of comments or thoughts or questions that they'd like to ask? Feel free to unmute. It's fine. Hi, Vicky. I've just noticed you're unmuted. Have you got something that you wanted to ask?
No, I think I've probably been unmuted the whole way through and not really realised.
Okay, so while you're unmuted, Vicky, how did you find the webinar? I'll just ask for your sort of feedback, what your thoughts were.
Really good. So I'm still a relatively new teacher, but I've moved from teaching predominantly HE to now teaching apprenticeships, and we've become very much online blended learning, and literally sort of pick everything up and go to Teams. So I'm looking at this as what can I do to sort of give it the learners a bit better experience. So that's what I was looking for, about how we use different tools, because we are having a problem sometimes with online engagement, because they will turn the screens off and just wander away and do their ironing. Or so it's, how do we get them to sort of look at that? So that's what I was sort of more interested in, really, is what's out there, what can we use to make it a better experience. And I've written down loads of stuff. I've got some ideas going forward about what we can do. So now I've signed up for your other bits and bobs, and I'm just looking at this Anki now.
Well, that's brilliant. Yeah, and I think that I would say, as I said at the start, the headsets have made a big difference, and I just saw that Jackson has just mentioned it as well. Yeah, so all staff have had a headset, and we gave staff a choice of 3 different types of headsets. So if I start my video, you'll be able to see me, hopefully. There you go. So mine's like a Britney Spears headset, which hooks over the top of my head, and that has been really sort of helpful in terms of improving, as we said, the clarity of the explanations online remotely, especially when we're trying to do a retrieval practice activity. If some of the students aren't catching what we're saying, that can sort of have a big impact on it. And obviously we want that retrieval practice to be at the forefront of everything we do. We know it boosts learning, so we want everyone to have that same experience. Some teachers have had the option of like almost like AirPods, where they just go into the ear, and I think that's just more preference, really. And for me, I've sort of preferred this choice. So every member of staff was given a choice. We used the Google Forms to do that. So we kept with the technology, used the technology to ask staff to vote what they wanted, and then every staff had one of those. So yeah, they are wireless, so you can move around the classroom. And as I said to you, one of the key parts is that blended learning is getting more seamless now, especially over the last week, because we've been able to stand at the door with the headset on, greet the pupils that are in school, still talk to the pupils that are coming in on Zoom, and they've got the activity to start straight away. That's 6 a day, and it just helps, really, I suppose, because cognitively, I found as a teacher myself that there's a lot going on now with students at home and students in school, and getting the lesson set up, and actually having that quick retrieval practice activity at the start and using the technology to do that has been really sort of helpful to sort of ease that beginning of lessons. And I think I just noticed someone, Risa said about consistency of retrieval practice remains strong. I think that's around the understanding of why we do it, and that we share that both with staff and with pupils. So understanding why it's important and the power that it can actually bring. And also it's about, and I think that Kate Jones has talked quite passionately about this, it's not necessarily about just doing a quiz. It's not necessarily about just doing X, Y, and Z. It's about having a varied diet to it. So although you saw a quiz there, we may start a lesson in a slightly different way, but it's still that active recall and knowledge. And yes, more than happy to share the online workbook, the structure of it. Happy to share that. It's a very sort of simple sort of template, but the key part there is to sort of aid that consistency across departments, across teachers, and whether pupils are at home or in the building themselves. So I don't know whether anyone else has got any other questions or thoughts. So, Reese, do you have a timetable for each subject for retrieval practice? Not necessarily, no, we don't have any specific timetable, Reese. Teachers have been sort of trained about how to use retrieval practice, the benefits of it. Through our sort of WebPed sessions, we've gone through how to utilize it in terms of this remote learning context and the blended and hybrid learning models. And then everyone has a range of strategies that they can sort of pull from, and then teachers sort of utilize those as they see fit. Okay, well, thanks for joining me this afternoon. I hope it was helpful. Or we have got one more actually. Yeah, so Judy's talked about being a split site school. I think for us, I mean, obviously we're not a split site, but I suppose if you think pupils at home learning and those in school kind of creates, I suppose, a split site really. I think that again, in terms of consistency and supporting staff, the fact that every member of staff has open access and can go in and join other teachers in their Zoom classroom to maybe observe how they're doing it, to support, to provide guidance and coaching. That's really been helpful to sort of support that consistency, whether it be them doing it at home or within school. So that's been really helpful. Okay, that's brilliant. Right, thank you everyone. Like I say, hope it was helpful. Hope it provided a bit of guidance. If you want any further questions, you can drop me an email, or you can message me on Twitter. This is our you can sign up to our EdTech sort of mail, and you can get some further information about what we're doing as a school and as a trust to really sort of move remote learning forward. Next week, we do have our webinar, which is from David Goodwin, and he's focused on how we can use sort of graphic organizers to support and boost learning in a remote context. So thanks everyone, and I'm going to sign off now. So have a lovely evening, and hopefully see you all next week if you find that might be a useful webinar for you.